Does Genesis not open that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which must encompass everything? What is there apart from the heavens and the earth? Is God not creating all of that out of nothing in Genesis 1?
No. The academic consensus these days, one, even if we translate Bereshit bara Elohim et shamayim ba'et haaretz, or et hashamayim ba'et haaretz, even if we translated that according to the traditional, now in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it doesn't necessarily demand creation ex nihilo, because the word created doesn't necessarily mean out of nothing. It could just be a fashioning of a kind of material substrate. However,
how you create a car. Steve Jobs creates an iPhone, but he doesn't sort of pop new material into existence.
Yeah. And even the verbal root bara in Hebrew, which is only ever used with God as the subject, it still does not mean out of nothing, because parents create children, or God creates children when couples get pregnant and stuff like that.
Right.
But I think the majority of scholars today would say that that's not a great translation of Genesis 1:1. Because the word Bereshit, which is traditionally understood to mean in the beginning, occurs, I think, 7 other times throughout the Hebrew Bible. And in every single occurrence, it is in the construct. And what that means is that in Hebrew, it doesn't just mean in the beginning, it means in the beginning of something. And so the of is whatever follows. And so you are seeing more translations of the Bible today that begin, the Hebrew literally would be in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. So it's a temporal clause, and more idiomatically in English, what you see in a lot more Bible translations today is when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 actually explains what already existed. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. In other words, God's like, all right, I'm ready to create. Here's my stuff that's already here. We got the darkness, we got the deep, we got the earth, and then what's the first creative act? Let there be light.
Yeah,
so
my friend has once joked to me that God is a mereological nihilist. I think it's a pretty hot philosophical take. My listeners will be familiar with it. I don't know if you've come across the idea of mereological nihilism.
It doesn't sound familiar.
It's sort of the view that, so mereology is the study of parts, and so mereological nihilism is nihilism about parts. So, for example, a chair is made up of a seat and some legs, but the designation, the distinction between those parts is basically all mental. It's not like a real substantive distinction. It's just something that our brains do. In the same way that if I say, does the left-hand side of a chair exist? It does, because the thing I'm referring to exists. It's right here. But clearly that, as distinct from the right-hand side, is like a mental distinction. And so just as the distinction between the left and right-hand side of the chair is purely mental, the distinction between the chair and its legs is also just purely mental. And then the mereological nihilist says, so is the distinction between the chair and the table, and the bird in the sky, and the camera on the tripod, right? And so what you've essentially just got is a bunch of matter that gets arranged, and humans put labels on it. Yeah. And my friend was like, God is the mereological nihilist, because if you look at Genesis, the sort of process that he undergoes is one of organization and labeling. You have an earth which is without form and void, and God starts sort of dictating. Having said that, I do think the creation of light probably doesn't lean into that very well, but I do find it interesting that when Adam is created, what's the first thing that he is asked to do? Well, what's his first task? It's to name the animals. It's to taxonomize. And so this idea that this creative process is really one of like organization and labeling, more so than popping into existence, I think is an interesting undertone perhaps to read into Genesis here.
And there's within cognitive linguistics, there's this idea of frame semantics, and which is and there are a lot of different variations on it, but basically the idea is everything is perspectival. It depends on who's doing the looking, who's doing the perceiving, the describing, and so whether or not a bike is in front of the house depends on where you're standing, and we're just kind of imposing organization on the input that we're receiving. But there's a scholar named Ellen Van Wold, who's a cognitive linguist, who talks about Genesis 1:1, and her argument is that bara, the verbal root bara, doesn't necessarily mean to create, but to separate. And so what's happening here, because when God does create the light, it must be separated from the dark. And so it's a process of basically drawing lines down the middle of things to create two separate categories, and then further, and then distinguishing
the heavens above from the heavens below, the waters above from the waters below, separating out, I suppose, different animals and breathing life into them. It's not like straightforward, I think, but certainly this theme of division occurring